To the German High Command entrenched in the hills of Sicily, the men of the 45th Infantry Division were nothing to fear. Nazi intelligence dismissed them as racially inferior. They called them savages from the American Southwest, undisciplined, primitive, unworthy of the uniform. But General George S. Patton, watching the invasion unfold through his field glasses on that scorching July morning in 1943, saw something entirely different. Where the Germans saw weakness, Patton saw a weapon unlike any other in the American arsenal. He saw a lethal focus that no West Point textbook could teach. While regular Army units were bogging down in the chaos of the beach landing at Scoglitti, terrified by the mortar fire and the screaming confusion of combat, the men of the 180th Infantry Regiment were already moving inland. They were the Thunderbirds. Nearly 2,000 of them were Native Americans, Muscogee Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, men who had been treated as second-class citizens back home. But here on the burning sands of Sicily, they were proving to be among the most formidable soldiers on the battlefield. Patton watched as they ignored the paralysis that gripped other units. He saw them slip out of the landing craft not as a panicked mob, but as a coordinated force. They didn't wait for officers to shout orders. They didn't wait for maps to be unfolded. They looked at the dry, rocky terrain of Sicily, land that resembled the badlands of Oklahoma and New Mexico, and they knew exactly what to do. While elite German paratroopers sat in their concrete bunkers expecting a frontal assault, the Thunderbirds were already flanking them. They moved with a silence that unnerved the enemy. They communicated with hand signals and subtle gestures, cutting through the noise of battle like ghosts. By the time the German machine gunners realized they were being hunted, it was already too late. The U.S. Army brass had been afraid to unleash these men. Top commanders in Washington worried they were too wild, too independent to fit into modern military doctrine. They wanted soldiers who marched in perfect step, but Patton didn't want a parade. He wanted a breakthrough. He looked at the red and yellow Thunderbird patch on their shoulders and smiled. He knew that while the enemy fought for a dictator, these men were fighting for something much deeper: their land, their brothers, and a warrior heritage that ran in their blood. The Germans had underestimated them. The American government had marginalized them. But on day one of Operation Husky, they were teaching the world a lesson in power. But before we continue this journey, tell me where you're watching us from, and may God bless you wherever you are. Now let's go deeper. To understand why these men fought differently, you have to look at where they came from. Most of the Native American soldiers in the 180th Infantry Regiment didn't grow up on paved streets with white picket fences. They came from places like the Chickasaw Indian Agricultural School in Oklahoma, a government institution built to assimilate them, to erase their culture. For years, they were told to forget their languages. They were punished for speaking the words of their ancestors. They were told to forget their traditions, to become civilized. But you cannot erase a heritage that runs in the blood. In the barracks of the 45th Division, you heard a symphony of languages that would baffle any German intelligence officer: Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole. To the rest of the army, and certainly to the enemy, they were simply the Indians. And among them, the warrior spirit loomed large, a reputation for endurance that seemed superhuman. There was a bitter irony woven into every thread of their uniforms. These men were training to defend a constitution that didn't fully recognize them as citizens. Back home, many couldn't vote in the very states they were drafted from. In some towns, they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers. They couldn't use the same water fountains. Yet when the call to arms came after Pearl Harbor, they didn't hesitate. They formed a brotherhood tighter than any standard platoon. They called each other brother, and they meant it. While other units struggled with the brutal heat and rough living conditions of training camps, the men of the 180th shrugged it off. They were used to hard land. They were accustomed to scarcity. They took the skills their grandfathers had used to survive on shrinking reservations: tracking, stealth, observation, reading the land, and they weaponized them. The U.S. Army had unwittingly created an elite force. They took men who had been raised to survive against impossible odds, gave them rifles and mortars, and pointed them at the greatest evil the world had ever seen. The weapon was loaded. It was time to pull the trigger. The baptism of fire. General Patton was not a patient man. By mid-July 1943, the invasion of Sicily was grinding forward slower than he could stomach. The roads were clogged with rubble. German resistance was stiffening. Patton, known as Old Blood and Guts, paced in his command tent, furious at every delay. He needed the Biscari airfield, a critical prize that would allow Allied planes to dominate the skies over southern Italy. But the airfield was a fortress, guarded by elite German paratroopers from the Hermann Göring Division, who had dug in deep. Regular infantry attacks were being chewed up and spit out. Patton needed a sledgehammer, but he didn't have one, so he reached for a knife. He ordered the 45th Division forward. This was the moment the legend of the Thunderbirds truly began to crystallize in the whisper networks of the war. The commanders knew that if they sent these men in a straight line across open ground, they would die like anyone else. But if they let them fight their way, that was a different story entirely. The officers of the 180th looked at the tactical maps. They studied the heavily defended roads leading to the airfield. Then they looked at the rough, broken terrain the Germans had left unguarded because they deemed it impassable. The order went down the line: drop the heavy packs, fix bayonets, we're going off-road. Patton watched the after-action reports coming in. He saw the speed at which they were moving. It defied conventional military logic. They weren't waiting for tank support. They were outpacing the armor. The general realized these men weren't just following orders. They were competing with each other to be first into the fight. He had demanded the impossible: take the airfield before the enemy can destroy the runway. And the men of the 45th simply tightened their bootlaces and stepped into the breach. Nighttime in Sicily is pitch black. The ancient stone villages shut out every flicker of light, and the olive groves transform into mazes of shadow. For the average American soldier in 1943, the night was terrifying. You couldn't see the enemy. You couldn't call in your superior air power. Standard doctrine said, dig in, wait for dawn. But the Germans quickly learned that the night belonged to the Thunderbirds. As the 180th closed in on Biscari airfield, they didn't stop when the sun went down. This was their time. Drawing on skills passed down through generations of hunters and trackers, they navigated without compasses, reading the stars and the silhouettes of the hills. They moved in a way regular troops couldn't replicate. They didn't clank their canteens against their gear. They didn't step on dry branches. One German sentry after another was neutralized before he could reach for his alarm flare. It was psychological warfare as much as physical combat. Imagine being a German soldier, confident in your fortified position, only to discover your perimeter has been breached without a single shot fired. The panic that spread through German lines was palpable. They started firing blindly into the darkness, wasting precious ammunition on shadows and wind. But the Thunderbirds weren't shooting back. Not yet. They were closing the distance. They were getting inside the enemy's guard. They crawled through irrigation ditches. They climbed over stone walls, getting so close they could smell the cigarette smoke of the sentries. They were setting the stage for an ambush from within. By the time the first flare went up to signal the main assault, the battle was already half won. The enemy thought they were fighting an army advancing from the front. They didn't realize they were being hunted by ghosts who had already infiltrated their lines. Blood and stone. Then the sun came up, and the stealth turned into a brawl. The battle for Biscari airfield was not a chess match. It was a fistfight with explosives. The Germans defending the position were from the Hermann Göring Division, the elite of the Luftwaffe ground forces. These were not old men and conscripted boys. These were fanatics, and they unleashed a storm of mortar fire and machine gun bullets that turned the dry Sicilian earth into a choking cloud of dust. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were sweating through their uniforms within minutes, their throats parched, their eyes stinging from dust and cordite. But where other units might have pulled back to regroup and wait for artillery support, the soldiers of the 45th pressed forward relentlessly. They used a tactic known as marching fire. Instead of taking cover, they kept advancing, firing their M1 Garand from the hip, suppressing the enemy through sheer volume of aggression. It was terrifying to watch. A sergeant from the Choctaw Nation led a direct charge against a machine gun nest that had pinned down an entire company. He didn't wait for support. He didn't call for a smoke screen. He ran in a zigzag pattern, dodging bullets, and silenced the gun with a single well-placed grenade. Across the airfield, similar scenes played out. Men from the tribes of the Southwest were engaging the pride of Hitler's army at point-blank range. It was brutal. It was bloody. The iron discipline of the German troops began to crack under relentless pressure. They had never encountered an enemy that simply refused to stop coming, no matter the cost. By early afternoon, the airfield fell silent. The runways were littered with debris and the bodies of the fallen, but they were in American hands. Patton arrived hours later, his jeep kicking up clouds of white dust. He looked at the carnage. He looked at the tired, dust-caked faces of the Native American soldiers cleaning their rifles and checking their ammunition. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. He had found his spearhead. But there is no rest for the weary in war. Before the dust had even settled at Biscari, new orders came down the chain. The next objective made strong men go pale. They called it Bloody Ridge, a jagged spine of rock near San Stefano that controlled the coastal road. The Germans had fortified it with everything they had left. They held the high ground, looking straight down the throat of the American advance. Standard military doctrine said you don't attack a position like that without massive artillery preparation and overwhelming force. But the element of surprise was gone, and time was running out. The 180th was told to take the ridge. They looked up at the steep, exposed slopes. It looked like suicide, but these men saw cover where others saw only death. They broke into small teams, shedding their heavy packs. They began the climb, not up the main trails where the Germans expected them, but up the sheer rock faces that the enemy thought were impassable. One observer noted they climbed like mountain goats, finding footholds in the craggy stone that no standard infantry boot should have held. When the firefight erupted, it was sudden and catastrophically violent. The Germans were shocked to find American soldiers emerging from the cliff edge right next to their bunkers, appearing like demons out of the stone itself. The battle for Bloody Ridge was fought with knives, bayonets, and grenades at distances measured in feet, not yards. It was a test of pure will. The inferior warriors drove the master race off the mountain foot by bloody foot, bunker by bunker. They took the ridge, but the cost was devastating. Men who had grown up together, who had left the reservation together, who had shared dreams of coming home, lay dead on the ancient Sicilian stone. The survivors stood on the peak, looking out over the Mediterranean, gasping for air in the thin mountain wind. They were victorious, but they were isolated. Their radios were cutting in and out through the rock. Their ammunition was running low. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they could hear the ominous rumble of German tanks in the valley below, turning to counterattack. They had climbed to the top of the world only to find themselves alone in the gathering dark. The whisper becomes a roar. Word travels fast in war, but fear travels faster. By the beginning of August 1943, German intelligence officers were puzzling over intercepted reports from their own front lines. The Wehrmacht soldiers, usually disciplined and stoic in their communications, were sending back frantic messages about a specific group of Americans. They called them Die Geistersoldaten, the ghost soldiers. Others used the phrase Die Krieger ohne Schreie, the warriors without screams. The Germans were accustomed to American troops who yelled orders, whose radios crackled constantly, whose heavy boots announced their presence. But these men from the 45th were different. They moved like smoke through the landscape. Survivors of German patrols spoke of being watched by eyes they couldn't see. They spoke of sentries found dead at their posts with their throats cut, the only sign of the enemy being a single feather left behind, or a crude symbol drawn in the dirt, a psychological taunt from men who knew how to instill terror. The legend of the Thunderbirds was growing, spreading from the foxholes of Sicily all the way up through the Wehrmacht chain of command. Even Allied high command began to realize they had something extraordinary on their hands. General Patton, who often viewed his soldiers as mere instruments of his grand strategy, paused to give credit where it was due. He famously remarked about the 45th Division, "Your fame shall never die. You are one of the best, if not the best division in the history of American arms." It was high praise from a man not known for flattery. But with reputation comes a heavy price. When the generals needed a unit to do the dirty work, to clear a minefield under fire, to storm a fortified farmhouse, to patrol a valley crawling with panzers, they didn't send fresh troops. They sent the Thunderbirds. Success didn't earn them rest. It earned them harder missions. And as the brutal Italian campaign ground on through 1943 and into 1944, the men of the 180th began to realize that their reward for being the best was simply the opportunity to die first. In the brief moments of quiet between battles, when the artillery stopped pounding and the dust settled enough to see the sky, the reality of their situation would sink in like a stone. Soldiers would sit in the shade of olive trees, meticulously cleaning their M1 Garans and read letters from home. These letters were a lifeline to another world, but they were also a stinging reminder of the reality they had left behind. A corporal might read news from his mother in Oklahoma telling him she had been refused service at a general store because of the color of her skin. Another might read about relatives still fighting just for the right to vote in state elections. Here they were, thousands of miles from home, bleeding for a flag that in many ways still saw them as wards of the state rather than full citizens. It was the great American paradox, written in blood and sacrifice. Why fight so hard? Why charge a machine gun nest for a country that treats you like a stranger in your own land? The answer wasn't found in political speeches or patriotic slogans. You could see it in the way they shared their rations with a wounded comrade. You could see it in the way they dragged a bleeding brother out of the line of fire, risking their own lives without a second thought. They didn't fight for the politicians in Washington who had marginalized their people for generations. They didn't fight for laws that held them down. They fought for the man standing next to them. They fought for the honor of their ancestors. The warrior code dictated that once you are on the war path, you do not turn back. You protect your brother. You honor your heritage through strength and courage. This shared adversity forged bonds of steel. The racism they faced back home seemed distant when compared to the immediate reality of a German Tiger tank bearing down on your position. A new test was approaching, one that would push them to the absolute breaking point of human endurance. The race to Palermo. The race to Palermo wasn't a tactical necessity. It was an ego trip for the generals, paid for in the sweat and blood of the infantry. The order was brutally simple: move fast, don't stop, beat the British to the capital. The 45th Division was ordered to cover over 100 miles of brutal, mountainous Sicilian terrain in a matter of days. The mechanized units had it hard. Trucks broke down in the searing heat. Tanks threw their tracks on rocky roads. But the infantry had it worse, and they knew it. This is where they truly earned the nickname, the Walking Army. With blisters on their feet that turned into open, weeping wounds, with water canteens running dry under the merciless Mediterranean sun, they marched. They marched at a pace that stunned military observers. While other units collapsed by the roadside from heat exhaustion, the Native American soldiers drew on reserves of stamina that went back generations. They remembered the stories their grandfathers told of running down deer across the plains. They remembered the long forced migrations of their people, the trail of tears, the long walk. They turned the march into a rhythm, a trance-like state where pain became just background noise to the drumbeat of boots on stone. They marched past stalled convoys of vehicles. They marched past British units that had stopped to rest and reorganize. When the enemy tried to slow them down with roadblocks or blown bridges, the Thunderbirds didn't wait for combat engineers. They scrambled down ravines carrying mortar base plates and heavy ammunition boxes on their backs, then climbed up the other side. When they finally crested the last hill and saw the ancient city of Palermo spread out before them, glittering in the Sicilian sun, they looked like ghosts risen from the earth. Their uniforms were caked in white limestone dust. Their eyes were hollow from 3 days without real sleep. Their lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. But they had done it. They had won Patton's race. They entered Palermo not as a parade formation, but as a conquering force of nature. The liberated citizens threw flowers from their windows, but the soldiers were too exhausted to smile. They had broken the spirit of the German defenders and shattered the speed records of the United States Army. General Patton got his glory. He got his headlines in the American newspapers, but the men who had carried the spear knew the brutal truth. They had walked through hell to deliver his victory. Sicily was theirs. The island was conquered. But as they looked across the narrow Strait of Messina toward the Italian mainland, they knew in their bones that the war was far from over. The mountains of Italy were higher, winter was coming, and the Germans were waiting with everything they had. Legacy written in blood. The Sicily campaign lasted only 38 days, but it changed the men of the 45th Division forever. As the guns fell silent and the exhausted soldiers found moments to rest, the Native American warriors of the Thunderbirds had proven their point in the most definitive way possible. They had taken everything the enemy could throw at them: racial slurs, elite troops, fortified positions, impossible terrain, and they had crushed it all. The skepticism of American officers had transformed into something approaching reverence. No one questioned their discipline anymore. No one questioned whether they could be controlled or integrated into modern warfare. They had become the tip of the spear, sharp, deadly, and pointed at the heart of fascism. 3 Native American soldiers from the 45th Division would earn the Medal of Honor for their actions in the European theater. Second Lieutenant Ernest Childers, a Muscogee Creek, became the first Native American to receive the nation's highest honor in World War II for his actions at Oliveto, Italy, on September 22, 1943. Despite a fractured foot, he single-handedly assaulted multiple German machine gun positions, using nothing but grenades, his rifle, and stones when his ammunition ran low. First Lieutenant Jack Montgomery, a Cherokee, earned his Medal of Honor at Anzio on February 22, 1944, when he almost single-handedly repelled a German assault, moving from position to position throughout the night to give the impression of a larger force. Technical Sergeant Van Barfoot, with Choctaw heritage, earned his Medal of Honor near Carano, Italy, on May 23, 1944. He advanced alone through a minefield, destroyed 3 machine gun nests, captured 17 German soldiers, and later that same day disabled a German Tiger tank with a bazooka while helping wounded comrades to safety. These were not isolated incidents. They were examples of a pattern repeated across hundreds of battlefields throughout the war. But the tragedy of the story lies in what happened when the guns finally stopped for good in 1945. These men who had liberated towns from Nazi occupation, who had defeated some of Hitler's most elite forces, returned home to an America that hadn't changed as much as they had hoped. They traded their M1 Garands for the struggles of civilian life on the reservation. Many of them placed their Purple Hearts and Silver Stars in drawers, rarely speaking of what they had done. The parades faded, the headlines moved on. They went back to being second-class citizens in the eyes of many laws, even though they were first-class heroes in the eyes of history and those who fought beside them. But among themselves, and in the memories of the men who served alongside them, the truth remained. They had shown the world that the warrior spirit is not defined by the color of a man's skin or the language he speaks, but by the fire in his heart and the courage in his soul. The legacy of the Thunderbirds and the Native American warriors who led the charge is not just a footnote in a dusty history book. It is a testament to resilience in the face of injustice. It is proof that honor and courage transcend politics and prejudice. They fought two wars simultaneously, one against Hitler's armies across the battlefields of Europe, and one for their own dignity and recognition in the country they called home. And in the end, despite everything stacked against them, they won both. So the next time you see that golden Thunderbird on a red diamond, remember the dust of Sicily coating their boots. Remember the silence of their night patrols. Remember Bloody Ridge and the men who climbed it. And remember the soldiers the United States was afraid to unleash, who turned out to be the very men who helped win the war. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. From wherever you are in this great world, stay safe, stay strong, and God bless.